The rain was a cold, rhythmic drumming against the window of the small corner diner, the kind of weather that makes the world feel heavy and forgotten. It was the sort of night that empties the streets and fills the few warm places that remain. The kind of night where the light spilling from a diner window looks less like a sign and more like a promise. Inside, the air smelled of bitter coffee and old wood, the particular combination that belongs to places that have been absorbing human stories for decades, soaking them into the walls and the worn edges of the counter and the booths with their cracked vinyl seats. It was a sanctuary for weary souls, and on this particular evening, it held more weariness than most. Arthur Sterling sat in the corner booth nearest the window. In the world he normally inhabited, the world of boardrooms and acquisitions and the kind of decisions that moved markets, he was known as a man of absolute control. His name carried weight in elite circles, where people described him with the particular mixture of admiration and wariness reserved for those who have accumulated enough power to exist by their own rules. He wore wealth like armor, had built a fortress of glass and steel around himself and his ambitions, and had maintained through sheer force of will the ice-cold demeanor that had become both his reputation and his shield. He had built all of this after losing his wife 3 years ago, thrown himself into the construction of it the way a man throws himself into physical labor after grief. Not because it helps exactly, but because it occupies the hands and gives the mind somewhere else to be full. Beside him sat his 7-year-old daughter, Emma. Emma was his entire world. She was the one thing in his life that existed entirely outside the fortress, the one person for whom the walls came down without his permission. She had her mother's face and her mother's particular quality of stillness, and loving her was the easiest and most painful thing Arthur had ever done, because Emma carried a silent struggle of her own. A neurological condition made her hands tremble, not constantly, not predictably, but in the moments that mattered most. The simplest tasks became mountains, holding a pencil, buttoning a coat, holding a spoon. Arthur watched her now, working at her soup with the concentrated effort of someone attempting something genuinely difficult. Her small hand shook around the handle. The liquid moved and spilled back before it reached her mouth, and her jaw tightened with the particular frustration of a child who understands exactly what her body is failing to do. Arthur's chest tightened in response. He was a man who had solved problems worth billions of dollars, who had negotiated outcomes that entire teams of experts had called impossible. And he could not fix this, could not buy his way past it or outmaneuver it or restructure it into something more manageable. He could only sit across from his daughter and feel the hollow ache of a father who has reached the absolute limit of what his power can do. He was aware of the room around them. The way people looked slightly to the left of their booth, uncomfortable with the visibility of their difficulty, not unkind exactly, but unable to hold the weight of it for more than a moment before their eyes slid away. He was used to that. He had learned to build a wall around that awareness, too. Their waitress moved through the diner like an invisible shadow. She was young, perhaps mid-20s, wearing a uniform that had been patched in places with careful, practical stitching. Her shoes had cracks near the soles. She moved efficiently, covering the floor with the practiced economy of someone who has been doing this long enough that the work has become automatic, freeing the mind for whatever it needs to be doing instead. Arthur had come to this diner regularly over the past several weeks. Emma liked it, liked the particular cup they served hot chocolate in, and he had watched this waitress each time. She never smiled, not in the performed way the job usually required. She was efficient and quiet and present in a way that was different from distant. She carried herself like someone with a great deal going on beneath a surface she had learned to keep very still. He had thought of her privately as a ghost with no story. He had not tried to learn otherwise. But then she did something no one else had ever done. She didn't look away. Emma's tremors were more visible tonight, the suit more difficult, the frustration climbing toward the surface of her expression. Arthur had watched other people notice and redirect their attention with the speed of discomfort. Maya, he would learn her name shortly, did the opposite. She stopped. She looked not with pity but with recognition, as if she were seeing something she understood. And then she did something that made Arthur start to rise from his seat with all the protective instinct of a man who has learned that the world's attention on his daughter rarely ends well. She pulled a chair and sat down beside Emma. Arthur opened his mouth. Maya held up one hand, a quiet, unhurried gesture. "It's okay," she said, and her voice carried something he couldn't immediately categorize, a weary kindness, the kind that has been tested enough times to know its own limits and has decided to show up anyway. She reached into her apron and drew out a small wooden spoon, the kind she apparently kept there, and in her movements there was no performance, no look-at-me quality, just simple focused attention on a child who needed help. She began to hum, a low, wordless melody, barely above a breath. Arthur went completely still. It was the song. The exact melody his wife had hummed to Emma in the evenings when she was very small, some half-remembered thing from her own childhood that she had never been able to name, only reproduce. He had not heard it in 3 years. He had not known anyone else knew it. He did not know how this woman in this diner on this particular night had arrived at those exact notes. He would wonder about it for a long time afterward and never fully resolve the wondering. And eventually he would decide that some things don't require explanation, only acknowledgement. Under Maya's patient, unhurried attention, Emma's tremors stilled. It happened gradually, the way tension leaves a body when it finally feels safe, not all at once but in layers, the shoulders dropping, the jaw releasing, the hands steadying. Emma ate, small, careful spoonfuls, but she ate. And a smile broke through her exhaustion, fragile and real, the kind of smile that costs something to produce and is worth everything to witness. Arthur felt something move in his chest that he had not felt in years. Not attraction, not yet, but something more fundamental, a raw and undefended human compassion that he had spent 3 years very carefully keeping at bay. He had been so focused on protecting Emma and himself from the world's casual cruelties that he had stopped noticing its quiet graces. He noticed one now. He watched Maya after that with a different quality of attention. Her hands, he saw, were red and raw from the cold water she worked in throughout every shift. She moved back through the diner when Emma's meal was done and resumed her work, but he watched her pause at the small refrigerator behind the counter, checking the expiry dates on the milk cartons with an expression he recognized. Not the look of someone stealing, but the look of someone calculating, planning, working out how to make something stretch or serve a purpose it wasn't originally intended for. When her shift ended, Arthur made a decision he would not have been able to fully justify if anyone had asked him to. He followed her. Not closely, not obtrusively. His black SUV moved through the night at a distance, and he watched as Maya walked 3 blocks through the sleet with her thin gray coat pulled tight around her, her head down against the cold. She didn't take a bus. She walked because the bus cost money. She entered a building several blocks from the diner. The kind of building that had once been serviceable and had since been forgotten by anyone with the resources to improve it. The elevator was out of service. The hallway was cold, with the specific cold of a place where the heat has been broken for weeks and no one with authority to fix it has gotten around to caring. He sat outside for a long time in his warm car. He thought about the song. He thought about the song. He thought about Emma's smile. He thought about the kind of person who walks 3 blocks in sleet after a double shift to go home to a cold room and thinks of themselves, apparently, as simply getting on with things. The next morning, he used the resources available to him. And he had considerable resources to learn more about her. What he found was not what the surface suggested. Maya's history was not a record of failure or poor decisions or the kind of gradual unraveling that people assume must explain circumstances like hers. It was something else entirely. She had been a pediatric nurse. A good one, by every account, the kind of nurse that families remembered by name, the kind that the children asked for by name. She had lost her license because she had used hospital supplies without authorization to save a homeless child's life, a child who would have died otherwise. She had known the consequences and she had made the choice anyway, because the alternative was not something she was capable of choosing. And then there was the rest of it. The reason she worked double shifts at the diner. The reason she lived in a room without reliable heat. The reason she checked expiry dates and walked in sleet and wore a coat that was losing the argument against winter. She was spending her entire salary, every dollar that came in, to pay the overdue school lunch balances of children in her neighborhood. Families who were working as hard as they could and still falling short. Kids who sat in school cafeterias where an outstanding balance meant you got a cold substitute meal or nothing at all. Who learned at 7 years old what it feels like when the system decides your hunger is a debt problem. Maya had known that hunger herself. She had sat in those rooms. She understood what it costs a child to learn that lesson, and she had decided quietly and without announcement that the children around her would not learn it while she could do anything about it. She was skipping her own meals regularly, living in the cold, saying nothing about any of it to anyone, because she was not doing it to be seen or recognized or rewarded. She was doing it because she believed that goodness still lives among us, and because she had decided somewhere along the way that believing it wasn't enough, that the job of the people who understood it was to be it. She hadn't sat beside Emma because it was her job. She had sat beside Emma because she recognized a soul that needed to be held in the silence, and holding people in the silence was simply what she did. Arthur sat with all of this information for a long time. He thought about the reputation he had constructed so carefully over the years. The precision, the coldness, the cultivated image of a man who had moved beyond ordinary sentiment into some more efficient mode of existence. He thought about all the mornings he had driven past people in difficulty and registered them as peripheral, as belonging to a category of problem that someone else was handling. He thought about the hollow in the center of his very expensive, very well-constructed life, and he thought about a 7-year-old girl's smile in a diner booth, and he felt something he could only describe as shame, not the hot, defensive kind, but the quiet kind that arrives when you understand something true about yourself that you had been successfully avoiding. This woman, with nothing, had been carrying more warmth and more integrity than he had managed with every advantage available to him. She had been holding other people's lives together in silence, the way certain people do, the ones we walk past, the ones whose circumstances we explain away, the ones we forget to see because seeing them would require us to feel something we're not prepared for. What Arthur did next was not a grand gesture, though it involved significant resources. He bought the diner. He renovated it and renamed it Sweet Olivia's Kitchen, and he transformed it into a community hub. A real one, the kind with warmth and food, and the specific dignity of a place that exists to serve people rather than to profit from them. No child who came through its doors would go hungry. That was the first and most important thing. He appointed Maya as Director of Employee Welfare, a real position with real authority and real compensation, not charity dressed up as opportunity, but a genuine recognition of what she had been doing all along, given the infrastructure to do it properly. The children in her neighborhood had their lunch balances cleared permanently through a foundation set up for exactly that purpose. He fixed the heater in her building. He made sure she had a coat that could win its argument with winter. He told her what he had found. He told her directly, the way she had always communicated, without performance, without packaging it into something easier to receive. He told her he had been living in a fortress and had forgotten somewhere inside it what it was like to be a person. He told her that his daughter had smiled in a way he hadn't seen in 3 years. He told her that he recognized the song and that he didn't know what that meant, but that it meant something. Maya listened to all of this with her characteristic stillness. And then she said that goodness doesn't actually need resources to exist, but that resources in the hands of people who understand what goodness is can do something real. And she said yes. Emma gained something she had stopped hoping for. Not a replacement for what she had lost, but a presence that understood how to be beside her in the particular way she needed. Arthur found his way back to himself, not by dismantling the fortress, but by choosing deliberately to leave its doors open. Their connection became something sacred, built on the specific understanding that two people carry when they have both been through things that required real strength and have both come out the other side still believing that the effort is worth it. True kindness does not require wealth. It requires only the willingness to see the person at the end of the booth, the one working double shifts in cracked shoes, the one carrying everyone else's weight in silence. It requires the willingness to pull a chair and stay. It requires the understanding that you don't have to be the most important person in the room to do the most important thing in the room. You just have to stay. Sometimes the people we pass without seeing are the ones holding everything together. Sometimes the person who appears to have the least is giving the most. Sometimes goodness travels quietly, in a worn coat, in the dark, 3 blocks through the sleet, without asking for anything in return. And sometimes, if we are paying attention, if we choose to look rather than away, it finds us exactly when we need it most and reminds us who we were before we learned to stop feeling. One act of compassion can change the direction of a life. One moment of choosing to see someone who feels invisible can rewrite everything. And sometimes it begins with something as small as pulling a chair, sitting down beside someone who is struggling, and deciding that their difficulty is worth your full attention. That is the architecture that lasts. Not glass or steel or the carefully maintained image of someone who needs nothing, but 2 hearts willing to understand each other, willing to sit in the silence together, willing to stay. If this story moved something in you, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that goodness still travels. Subscribe to Pure Kindness and join a community that believes in the power of a single act of compassion to change everything. We want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed a silent angel, someone who gave everything they had to a stranger and asked for nothing in return? Share your story in the comments below. Your words might be the exact thing someone needs to read today. Because you don't have to be the most important person in the room to do the most important thing in the room. You just have to stay. Thank you for being here.